welcome to Hard Talk.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
There is no doubt that it is not just you that has suffered from repressive tactics coming from government agencies. We can all see that. But nonetheless, the notion that all sorts of freedom of expression are now curtailed and eliminated in the Philippines surely isn't right. If one looks at your country today, there is still a multitude of diverse opinion across the spectrum of politics in different platforms on the media, not least Rappler itself. After all, your website hasn't been shut down. It continues to this day. It has millions of eyeballs on it every single month. The Philippines is not North Korea, nothing like.
I asked him that specifically. I said, you know, Mr. President, now that you're in charge of actually protecting the Constitution, is it necessary to use violence? And he said, yes. He said it's necessary to use violence and fear. So while you see what looks like a multitude of voices, imagine that those voices also have a Damocles sword hanging over their heads. During our pandemic, people were, based on their posts on social media, people were arrested. I think there's a good veneer of legality for all of these, but we've certainly felt the walls closing in. In order to be able to continue publishing as Rappler, look what I've had to go through. I'm not a criminal, I'm just a journalist.
And obviously, my show's called Hard Talk, so I have to take seriously the charges against you, because as you've indicated that the libel is the least of it. You still face allegations of, my goodness, what a list, fraud, tax evasion, receiving money from the CIA. I mean, you could be in court for years and years to come. Maria Ressa, do you think the Filipino public care about your fate, and indeed the fate of other journalists in your country? Because one looks at Duterte's approval ratings, they are consistently above 80% approval, the kind of figure that other leaders around the world could only dream about. And the Filipino public are well aware of what he's doing to the press.
I think there are two answers to that question. The first one is the kinds of the propaganda machine and how it uses technology to essentially use it as a behavioral modification system. The second one is, do people care? Yes. And I can see that just based on what's happened. And I think this in particular in 2020, three things have happened. We've had a pandemic, the lockdown. We are just in our 14th week of a very security-driven, militaristic lockdown. It's a lockdown when President Duterte has told Filipinos to stay at home. And he told troops that if they come out, if we break quarantine, he told them to, and this is a direct quote, he said, shoot them dead. That did happen. Almost more than 60,000 people have been arrested during this time period. And because we're locked down, I think there's been more introspection. The second is the shutdown.
I'm going to stop you there, if I may, because it's fascinating what you're saying, but I'm just wondering where your evidence is, because I look at the latest polling I can find in the Philippines. There's a company I'm sure you know well, Social Weather Stations, who are widely respected, and their measurements suggest that the Filipino public as a whole approves still of President Duterte's campaign against illegal drugs. They still seem to favor him, despite all of the controversy about his latest anti-terror law, which you and others have described as a fundamental threat to freedom of expression.
That's the third one, right? That's the third one I was going to say, this anti-terror bill.
You have to get real, in a way. Everything you say about what Duterte is doing is not deterring a really big majority of Filipinos from giving him their backing. I'll tell you what that plants in my mind, a different idea about fear. Maybe for you, and let's be honest, for a relatively elite personality living in a nice part of Manila, with perhaps more security than most Filipinos, it is easy for you to focus on the threats to freedom which you feel and the fear you talk about. But what about the other Filipinos whose fear is much more street level? It's much more about the insecurity. And your Rappler website has made a point of investigating the drugs war that Duterte has initiated for the last 3-4 years. But the drugs
Yes.
war, according to most Filipinos, has made their streets safer. Yes, they look at the fact that hardly any security personnel have been prosecuted for egregious use of violence, but they also look at the fact that thousands of drug dealers have been taken off the streets, and they like that. Let me ask you a personal question, and be brief if you can.
Sure.
As the boss of Rappler, which is known for its investigations, including of the drugs war, do you now
Yes.
think very carefully before commissioning any reporter to dig into what is happening on the streets? I'm mindful that journalists have been killed this year. More than 100 journalists have been killed in the last couple of decades in the Philippines. It is dangerous being a journalist. Are you now fearful for your own staff?
That's a really good question. In a way, we've been forged in fire. And I think the biggest lesson we've learned in the last 4 years is that when there's a Damocles sword hanging over your head, if you let it affect you, then you've lost it.
Let's talk about international reaction and response to what is going on in the Philippines right now. We have international NGOs like Amnesty International condemning what they call, quote, a policy of large-scale murdering enterprise, they call it. We had, as you said, the UN Human Rights Office report referring to near impunity offered to Philippines security personnel. But what we also see is that consistently over the last 4 years, Donald Trump, for example, has referred to President Duterte as his friend. We see a very close relationship developing between Duterte and the Chinese government. And we see, for example, that the International Criminal Court, which appeared to be ready to investigate what was happening in the Philippines, has essentially been neutralized because the Philippines has refused to recognize its legitimacy. The international community, frankly, has let you down, hasn't it? Making my point for me that whatever the detail of difficulties, geostrategic difficulties in a relationship between the United States and the Philippines, in the end there seems to be a sort of brotherhood feeling between Donald Trump and Rodrigo Duterte. And it's not surprising given that they are, you could argue, populists of a similar style. They have contempt for much of the media, which we've discussed. They both seem to see journalists, quote unquote, as enemies of the people. And they both, it is true to say, have found a way of communicating through social media, through using Twitter and Facebook platforms in a way that politically is extraordinarily successful.
I would agree with you.
I have to interrupt because that's so what you are suggesting is that democracy doesn't work anymore. If you are talking about quote unquote manipulated public opinion as you've just done, then you're undermining and delegitimizing the notion that the people have a right to choose their governors. If you're saying that their opinions are somehow fake or false, where is democracy? Suggesting to me that President Duterte, in the end, is illegitimate and doesn't have a mandate, when patently,
no,
on
that's
paper,
not what I'm saying.
This man has an extraordinary mandate.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, first of all, he doesn't have an extraordinary mandate. He was one of 5 presidential candidates. He had, out of 61 or 62 million voters, he had 16 million votes. That's what elected President Duterte. That's okay. Of 5, he won the majority of the 5, right? But beyond that, what I am saying is that the new information ecosystem actually allows lies laced with anger and hate to spread faster than facts. When a lie is told 1 million times in today's age, when I am attacked 1 million times with criminal, it becomes a fact. And this is what's wrong. Because if you don't have integrity of facts, you cannot have integrity of markets, and you certainly can't have integrity of elections. This is the problem with democracy.
A final thought then. I'm very mindful that you returned to the Philippines from the United States after the People Power Revolution of, I believe it was 1986, and you made your life in the Philippines after that. And there was so much hope around then of a different kind of politics in your country. Here's what one Filipino lawyer who moved to Australia recently has written, Jason Lamchek. He says, in terms of corruption, the post-people power governments became indistinguishable from the Marcos regime. The only difference was the rhetoric of human rights and democracy, which people have increasingly come to regard as a sham. Isn't that the truth, that Duterte is in power and, quote-unquote, so successful because the post-people power politics of the Philippines simply failed the people?
I think I would agree that post-people power was a failure. We had endemic corruption. We replaced one set of leaders with another who then created their own. I mean, we've always said there are 8 oligarchical families, but the difference is this, right? The trickle-down effect didn't trickle down. There was a perfect storm, and this happened globally. This is part of the reason you're seeing a trend back to a form of, I would say, almost fascism, right? Because liberal democracy didn't deliver its promise. But having said that, we should not be moving the other direction. And that is the challenge to every democracy here. Part of what's enabled that is social media. When the gatekeepers, the journalists, the news organizations used to be gatekeepers, we kept the public sphere. We all agreed on the facts. Now that the gatekeepers are tech companies, the abdication of that responsibility has had huge impact. And what we're seeing now is the growth of, oh my gosh, I'm even going to say almost like fascism all around the world. And this is scary for me here in the Philippines because we're one of the first signatories for the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And yet I see Filipinos, things I would have thought would have been unbelievable. Filipinos are saying it's okay to kill. Filipinos saying that, democracy doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't. But I guess this is where I would like to see Filipinos weigh in. We shouldn't look away. We should make an active choice. And when you see your rights getting pushed back, I personally saw my rights being violated when that happens, are we going to accept that? Because then that will fundamentally change democracy. So maybe we should.
Yeah, so we have to end, but I'm just thinking, never mind the threat of prison now hanging over your head, you continue this fight.
It's not just about prison. The journey is the battle, because I think there's so much more at stake. If it was just me, I would, I'd be quiet. Why not? But there's so much at stake for us right now. I became a journalist in 1986, and I'm a journalist today. I'm at my most senior, and I want to make sure that I do the right thing for democracy, for journalism.
Maria Ressa, thank you very much indeed for being on Hard Talk.
Thanks for having me.